Hi, and welcome back to the Beginner Basics Crochet course. My name is Joanna, and I've been taking you along this journey of learning how to pick the right kind of yarn for your first crochet project, picking out the right size hook, and teaching you some of the basics like how do you hold the yarn, how do you hold the hook, and working through some of the first stitches. So we've covered the single crochet, the half double crochet, and the double crochet. And now we are ready to work on our first crochet pattern. But first, we probably need to know how to read this. So here is the Wild Blue wall hanging pattern. This is the PDF pattern that if you were to purchase it, you could print it out and have it in front of you as you work up your own wall hanging. But the full pattern is free on the blog too. So first, let's go over some of the sections that you might see in every crochet pattern. So you're going to have the title of the pattern, probably who has designed it. Some designers include a finished picture of what the item would look like. Some do not. It just kind of depends on the designer preference and whether or not they want to have a more printer-friendly version of a crochet pattern. The next part is also sometimes an optional part. I really like to include an introduction of the crochet pattern, explaining what the pattern is, what the experience level you will need, maybe some things that I really love about this pattern, like the wild blue wall hanging. I love that we're going to use a bunch of easy beginner stitches that creates a really interesting texture and is a fun project for your first crochet project. And then I also like to include a note about if you need any help, just please reach out. I'm happy to do that. The next section you are going to have is a material section. So every well-written crochet pattern will have every single thing that you need to work up the crochet pattern. So I always include the yarn, exactly what yarn I used, sometimes where you can purchase it from, sometimes not, always a category, and I guess like the title of the category. So I used a worsted weight yarn and it's a category 4. And I always give like how many yards or meters it is versus how much one skein weighs, and then always what the yarn is made out of. This is important to know because different types of yarn work up a little differently, and if you need to substitute the yarn, you need to know what size of yarn it is to make sure your finished project is the same size. And then I always give how many yards approximately you will need to make this pattern. Other things that are also included is crochet hook. I give the US size, the I9, and then the millimeter size. If you are working up crochet patterns and they don't give this size, feel free to reach out to the designer and double check. You can always guess and make up a gauge, but it's super helpful to have this millimeter size. And then for this crochet pattern, since it's a wall hanging, I'm going to tell you that you're going to need some scissors, a tapestry needle, a tape measure so you can measure your final project or measure your gauge. You will need a dowel rod, and I list exactly what type of dowel rod I used, and you'll need an extra piece of twine or yarn for hanging. And I'm going to flip it over, and we're going to come to the other side. So now we're on page 2. So next, this section is probably one of the most golden sections you will have in a crochet pattern. This is the notes section. So here the designer will give you extra information for you to know about the actual steps of making the project. Here you will find things like experience level. I usually put my experience level and different techniques that you should have an understanding of before you start this pattern. So I have single crochet, half double crochet, double crochet, before starting the pattern. And then also right here, I have listed different links to tutorials for the crocheter. And then I always include this tidbit about gauge. Always check your gauge. Always, always. I guess the only part I would not check my gauge on is if I just didn't care what my finished size was for my project. Your gauge will be different than my gauge. We all crochet differently. So please, please, please check your gauge. I have made the mistake of not checking my gauge, working up a wall hanging, and the wall hanging was almost twice as big as what the pattern stated. And why did I do this? Because the designer added gauge is not important, so I did not check it. So to avoid that mistake, I always suggest to check your gauge. It takes a couple minutes to do, and it'll save you so much time in the end. And then here, this is just saying that the chain ones and the chain twos at the beginning of a row, so your turning chain, does not count as a stitch. This will be super important when you get to counting stitches later on in the pattern. Okay, so now here I have an extra picture. This is an up close picture of what the stitches will look like, of what the pattern actually looks like, because sometimes you can't quite tell that from the finished picture. So this is a, obviously zoomed out so you can see the whole finished item. And then this part will be a zoomed in up close. So here we've got gauge and finish size. And please excuse my printer, I guess, messed up a little bit. So this is going to be the part that you're going to gauge off of, or you're going to use this information to work up your pattern and make sure it's the same size as the pattern. So I've got 13 stitches times 10 rows equals a 4 by 4 inch square. So what you will do is you will follow the gauge stitch pattern. Sometimes designers will say it's so many rows of the actual written instructions. Here, since this is a absolute beginner pattern, I went ahead and created a gauge stitch pattern right here. It is the exact same as the pattern here of the pattern instructions. The only difference is that this has 32 stitches and this one has 16. And that's just to create a 4 by 4 inch square. So other things needing to know in the gauge is that the gauge is, use the stitch pattern below to create the gauge. Sometimes designers will just say use single crochet or half double crochet to make a gauge, and that's all that you do. And then the gauge is measured before blocking. So this will give the gauge before and after blocking can be different. So it's good to know that when you make a gauge swatch, you're going to measure before you block. This is important because some garments patterns will say you need to measure the gauge after you block it. All right, and then the stitches are counted on the double crochet row, just meaning that if you can see this kind of taller stitch right here, this is the double crochet row. This is where I measured the stitches along, just to give you a more accurate gauge count. And then here is the gauge stitch pattern, and then right down here I have the finished size, width, and height. All right, let's move on to the next page. So here is the stitch abbreviations. So if you've been following along with the Beginner Basics Crochet class, you will know that I have been starting to add all the abbreviations week after week as soon as we started to learn how to single crochet. This was to get you to practice and to be familiar with the abbreviations that are most commonly used in crochet patterns, because this is now a shortened form of the crochet pattern. Instead of writing out single crochet every time and chain every time, we now have a more condensed pattern that we can follow, and it'll be a little less confusing. So these, I tell you that were written in US terms. I briefly mentioned that US terms are different than UK terms, so you need to know which terms you need to be following. And then I have every single term that is listed that I use in the pattern. Okay, so now we have pattern instructions. This is the part where we're going to actually be making the pattern. Finally, we've done our gauge, we've checked it, it looks great, and now we need to do the pattern. So simply create a chain of 33. So you just chain 33, and you move on to row 1, and you'll have stitch counts here. You'll have if you need to turn it or not turn it, and then you have any repeats that the designer wants you to do. And at the very end, so he says repeat, so rows 6 through 29, repeat rows 2 through 5. So after row 29, you're going to leave a long, leave the working yarn attached, because we'll use it to crochet the wall hanging to the dowel. So now you are done. Now you know you shouldn't fasten off. You don't need to weave in any ends yet. You need to move on to the next step. Okay, so we've made it to this section here, and I've gone ahead and went over it with you, but I wanted to actually crochet some of it up and show you how to actually read the pattern and crochet at the same time. So here, the very beginning of the instruction says create a chain of 33. So we know that we need to create a slip knot and then insert our hook into that loop and then pull the knot tight, but not too tight. Okay, so now we make a chain of 33. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I've got a length of 33 chains. And then now the first row says single crochet in the second chain from the hook. So we're going to find the first chain and skip that chain and find the second chain, and that's where we're going to start single crocheting. So let's go ahead and make a single crochet in that chain. All right, and then the next sentence says single crochet in each chain across. So that means in every single one of these chains that I just made, we'll need to have a single crochet. Okay, so now I have single crocheted in every single chain across, and I have made my first row. So at the very end of row 1, we have a chain 2 and turn. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. So chain 1, chain 2, and then turn my work. Now, before I turn my work, I will make sure that I have counted and I have 32 stitches on my row. If I don't have 32 stitches, I will pull it out and do it again until the stitch count is right. For this pattern, it's a very forgivable pattern. So if you have 30 stitches or 31 or maybe 33 or 34, it'll be okay. Just make sure that you have the same stitch count for every row. Some patterns, when you get a little more experienced and you've kept practicing a little bit more, you will need to make sure that your stitch count is perfect every row. All right, and so now if I go down to row 2, it says double crochet in each stitch across the row. So that means every single stitch that I see will need to have a double crochet. So I will do a few here just to kind of show you what it'll be like. If you've been following along with the Beginner Basics Crochet course, this will look really similar to row 1 and row 2 of the stitch tutorial videos. We're just putting all of those stitches together in this crochet pattern. See, we're just lining them up on top of each other. And so we'll continue the double crochets all the way across. And it says to chain 1, turn, double check your stitch count, make sure you have the same stitches in row 1 as row 2, and then you can move on to row 3, which is just half double crochet in each stitch across the row later on in the pattern. So here I have written instructions on how to crochet the dowel to the wall hanging. There will also be a link in the pattern for a video tutorial on this. And then we'll just flip to the last side. This is all the contact information of the designer. Hopefully there is a thank you for purchasing the pattern and for using it. And then another kind of call to action to say, hey, if you need any help, please contact me. So you have my name, my business name, my email address that I most frequently use, and then also an encouragement that if you've made this pattern, tag me on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, wherever you like to crochet, or just email me a picture. And then also just a copyright policy, just saying that you're free to use this pattern and to sell the finished project, but please don't republish it or distribute any of the actual written pattern anywhere else because it's not yours. So that means this section right here. So you cannot copy and paste this and share this on social media with your best friend or anything. And so, yeah. All right. So that was just a real quick kind of brief overview of how to read a crochet pattern. I hope this was pretty helpful. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments. And there you have it.